Topic: Recent Trends in Translation Studies, where the finer details and the new directions in translation studies are discussed. The speaker is Dr. K.M. Sharif, Associate Professor at the Department of English, University of Calicut. Over to Dr. Sharif.
The paradigm shift in translation studies in the 80s of the last century, which unequivocally established translation as a form of rewriting, turned out to be only the beginning of a tremendous overhauling of the discipline in the years that followed. The Rewriting Culture School of Translation Studies, represented by Susan Bassnett, André Lefebvre, Mary Snellonby, Theo Hermans, Lawrence Venuti, and a host of others, also placed politics at level with aesthetics in translation studies. The focus of translation studies appeared to shift from process to product. The conditions under which texts were rewritten and the implications of such rewritings came to be widely discussed. Translation was positioned as one among many forms of rewriting. This, as we shall see, was to lead to the emergence of adaptation studies a few years later. Although Roman Jakobson had discussed intralinguistic and intersemiotic translations nearly half a century back, it was only with the establishment of translation as a form of rewriting that film adaptation, the rewriting of novels as radio plays, and other forms of intralingual and intersemiotic rewriting were seriously studied. Translation scholars also began to distinguish between rewritings within the same culture and rewritings across cultures. The 90s saw the post-colonial turn in translation studies. The American translation scholar Lawrence Venuti observed the asymmetrical relations that existed between hegemonic and marginalized cultures, which were manifest in the selection of text to be translated, the process of translation, and the reception of translated texts. Indian translation scholars like Harish Trivedi and Mahashweta Sengupta also made significant interventions in post-colonial translation studies. The kind of post-colonial translation strategy known as cannibalism, first theorized and practiced by the Brazilian translator and translation scholar Harold de Campos, by which canonized texts from the colonizers' cultures were deconstructed, dismembered, and reconstructed as new originals, began to receive serious attention. The co-option of feminism and the emergence of a feminist school of translation studies also were important developments in the 1990s. Early work in the area came from Canada. Canadian translators like Barbara Godard, Louis von Flotow, and Merlin Wilderman came up with translations that challenged patriarchal constructs and contributed to the building of a feminist culture. Translation scholars like Sherry Simon and Laurie Chamberlain found translation a gendered process and called for the feminist rewriting of the canon in translation. The impact of globalization on translation was discussed by Lawrence Venuti, Michael Cronin, and others who saw the emergence of entirely new paradigms in the practice of translation and in the production and distribution of translated texts in a globalized world. A critical result of all these new deliberations was a rethinking of the identity of the translator. The invisibility of the translator in traditional thinking on translation was addressed. Instead of a mere secondary activity, translation was recognized as original writing in its own right and the translator as a full-fledged author. Although literary translation accounted for less than 5% of the total volume of translations produced in Europe and America at the end of the 20th century, it continued to dominate translation studies. This was natural, given the high culture status of literary discourse in most societies. But translation in the mass media, along with technical translation, began to feature in discussions on translation at this point of time. Audiovisual translation also began to get the attention it deserved. The pioneering work of Jorge Diaz-Cindes in the field was followed by several studies on subtitling and dubbing, the two most common forms of audiovisual translation. With a huge market for screen translation, audiovisual translation studies took on an unprecedented practical dimension. This and the production of real-time subtitling in news programs on the visual media led to studies on audiovisual translation taking on an increasingly technical orientation. With its recent popularization in the visual media, Translation into sign language for the hearing impaired has also come in for serious scholarly discussion. The entry of technology into translation goes back to the 50s of the 20th century. The influence of structural linguistics was responsible for the rise of the idea that languages could be programmed into translation rules or algorithms in a computer which would generate the equivalent target language text on being fed with the source text. Today, it's widely accepted that machine translation works efficiently only with controlled languages and that it can never completely replace human translators. The more modest term computer-aided translation attests to this realization. Of course, computer-aided translation eliminates time-consuming hack work in technical translation, works perfectly in domains like weather forecasting, traffic control, and public address systems, and does a tolerably good job in simultaneous interpretation in international conferences. The possibilities of the deployment of digital technology in translation have been unraveled in recent years in the production of translation memory software, which are interactive corpuses of translation equivalents: text-to-text, sign language to speech, and speech to sign language. Michael Cornin's book Translation in the Digital Era, published in 2013, looks at the state of the application of digital technology in translation in the contemporary world, which is witnessing a relentless drive towards automation. Although André Lefebvre and other translation scholars in the Rewriting Culture School of Translation Studies position translation as one among many forms of rewriting, the full range of cultural productions which could be called rewritings was not visualized till the advent of adaptation studies as a discipline at the turn of the present century. The emergence of adaptation as a category merely represented the theoretical formulation of a practice that was more than 2,000 years old in cultures across the world. In a way, adaptation can be taken as just another name for rewriting. Although the term was originally used to signify only film adaptations of literary texts, it today represents rewriting across a wide spectrum of cultural forms, including literary texts, films, radio plays, paintings, performance texts, musical compositions, and sign language texts. John Milton, one of the theorists of the discipline, offers a long list of the processes of adaptation: recontextualization, tradaptation, spin-off, reduction, simplification, condensation, abridgment, special version, reworking, offshoot, transformation, remediation, and revision. Adaptation studies have succeeded in shifting critical attention away from the traditional binary of original or antecedent text and its rewriting and focusing it on intertextuality. Julie Sanders has drawn a distinction between two forms of adaptation: adaptation proper and appropriation. Adaptation, however much it departs from the antecedent text in rewriting it, still refers to it, privileging it as the original point of departure. An appropriation, on the other hand, is fundamentally the rewriter's text, often a drastic rewriting which maintains only an intertextual relationship to the antecedent text without privileging it as the original point of enunciation. Sanders has also pointed out the ways in which many texts maintain intertextual relationships with a number of other texts through references and allusions, which are often not straightforward invocations but rewritings. Any text may represent the adaptation or appropriation of more than one clearly recognizable antecedent text. Thomas Leitch points out how adaptation studies has opened up a vista of unlimited intertextuality in which each text floats upon a sea of countless earlier texts from which it could not help borrowing. Linda Hutchins' division of all texts into three categories, telling text, showing text, and interactive text, represents a new turn in adaptation studies. By interactive text, Hutchins chiefly refers to video games which, as she points out, like other texts, can be adaptations of antecedent texts. Linda Hutchins has also pointed out that given the stranglehold of global capital on the cultural industry, paradigms of adaptation in the visual media are often determined by market forces. After the pioneering work of Sanders and Hutchins, two collections of adaptation studies which document adaptation practices and analyze them critically have been published. The first of them, published in 2010, is Adaptation Studies New Approaches, edited by Krista Albert Crane and Dennis Hutchins. The other, published in 2013, is Adaptation Studies New Challenges, New Directions, edited by Jorgen Brun, Annie Gelsvik, and Erik Fisvold Hansen.